I now have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. And Lindsay Levin, to me, is a very interesting paradox of a human being. Lindsay comes across as extremely quiet, extremely smart, but what I've been taken with since I've gotten to know her is that she actually wants to do some of the hardest work that I think any of us can do, which is to get people with paradoxically different opinions together and take on things like the environment, smart cities, solving world peace, poverty, hunger, and that is her deeply held belief, is that that can be done through conversation and from shared beliefs and from openly talking about those opposing views and bringing them together. So I don't know about you, but we may teach conflict management, but taking this on as a practice in the world and bringing people together is fascinating. To do that, she has formed a company called Leaders Quest, and you're all going to get a sample of Leaders Quest with the quest we go on this afternoon, and that is part of what Leaders Quest does, is helps organizations go places in order to learn things they want to learn, to see things differently. So I'd like you to all join me in welcoming Lindsay, and let's look through different lenses and see what there is to learn.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Fred team. It's a real privilege to be here with you all. I'm very excited about spending time this afternoon out with you all, and thanks also to the presenters this morning. I think we've had a wonderful morning. So what I want to do is to begin by taking you on a walk in the woods with me. And it's a walk that I made about 20 years ago in a forest that looks something like this. And I went there with a group of friends, including an ecologist. And our ecologist friend was explaining to us how the carbon cycle works and the role of the trees and the rivers and the sea in creating a healthy ecosystem. And partway through the walk, he asked us all, happily it was a warm, dry day in Britain, southwest England, not always that way, but it was a warm, dry day, and he said, I want you all to lie on the ground, on your faces, and just look at what's in front of your eyes. So I lay down, and I did just that. I looked at what was in front of my face, and I saw lichen and moss just a few inches in front of me. I saw clouds of colour and intricate patterns and beautiful details and exquisite little flowers. And it made me think of some pictures that I'd seen just a few months earlier, pictures of the universe taken from the space telescope Hubble. Now, whenever I see pictures like these beautiful pictures of our universe, I'm reminded of some images and of a story about the god of the heavens, the god Indra. And according to the story, when Indra created the universe, he made it as a net, and at every knot in the net, he wove in a pearl. And Indra's net symbolizes the universe as a web of connections. And everything that exists, here we go. There we go. Everything that exists, everything that's ever existed, every idea that can be thought of is a pearl in Indra's net. And every single pearl reflects an image of every other pearl, of the whole net. Well, lying on that forest floor, I think I truly understood that idea for the first time. The beauty of the tiniest elements of nature and the vast wonder of the universe, an unthinkably vast universe, that sense that each is part of the other and that we're all connected. So astronauts have got a term for this. They call it the overview effect. It's the awe they feel when they first go up into space and they look back at the Earth and they see this fragile blue glowing planet with its wafer-thin atmosphere, and they know that they're looking at home. Well, when I was 5 years old, the astronauts of Apollo 8 sent back the first of these photographs, and anybody with a TV was able to sit in their living room and to see, for the first time, our world from afar. And I think that changed, in many ways, our perspective on our home. So what's all this got to do with leadership? Well, when I first encountered Fred, it was only last year, but I was really struck by the mission that you've created. That following on from the financial crisis, the question of when we'd really arrived in a terrible place, frankly, in terms of leadership, what kind of leadership do we need in the world? And a response to some of those crazy excesses that had led to the financial crisis. I think many of those consequences are still with us today. But I also think that we're in the midst of an even greater one. Politically, in many places, including my home country of Britain, and including my adopted country of the US, we're in, I guess to say the least, uncharted waters. Socially, we're faced with real challenges of polarization, of inequality, of fear, and actually sometimes of rage. And ecologically, we've crossed into some unprecedented territory. It's widely accepted that we've breached 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries defined by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. These are the boundaries for things like biodiversity, for climate change, for land use, within which humanity can develop and thrive for years to come, but which, when we cross them, we risk large-scale, abrupt, and irreversible change. Kind of things that we're looking at here. It's no surprise that human behaviour is having this kind of impact on the planet. In the mid-1800s, there were about 1 billion people on Earth. By the 1970s, we had 4 billion people. Today, as you all know, we have about 7.5 billion people. And by 2050, we're going to be well over 9 billion. In many ways, it's because of extraordinary progress in healthcare, in sanitation, in nutrition. Life expectancy has more than doubled in the last 100 years alone. But today's challenges are new ones. They're not the same. And if I was going to sum them up as one big leadership question, it might go something like this. How can 9 billion people live rewarding lives in well-functioning societies and in harmony with our biosphere? Yeah, I know it's a very big question. But I think we have to be prepared and able to go to the big questions. We can't address today's complexity from silos. And there's a natural tendency to break things down. We're listening to this morning, to break things down into manageable chunks, into questions that we feel we have some control over. It's what companies do. Business leaders don't want to spend their time dealing and worrying about things that they have little influence over. They've got short-term targets to meet, and doing that, as we all know, is extremely hard. I work a lot with corporate leaders. I have huge respect for the difficulties of dealing with the short term, let alone worrying about the bigger picture and the long term. I think, given that we've got this wonderful luxury of this spa, these 3 days together, time away from the day-to-day, it's an amazing opportunity to actually step back and look at the big picture. So what happens when we do that? What does the big picture show? Well, I think it shows that our modern economies, our current way of doing business, where we measure financial outcomes but rarely focus on social or environmental ones, is simply not sustainable. The fact that we don't account for natural capital, the fact that we don't reflect enough on the social consequences and the communities that we impact. Business can be and is very often an incredible force for good. Companies have played an extraordinary role in human development. But some of the models, frankly, that have served us well in the past need a serious rethink. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. Life is change, nature is change, growth is change. The idea that capitalism has somehow arrived at an end point and is cooked and done is evidently absurd. So I think that one of the great leadership challenges that we face today is to turn a situation that can feel overwhelming and frightening into an opportunity to reimagine how we live and how we work. to see it as an invitation to creativity, to passion, to brilliance, across the generations, across cultures, to the many different perspectives we've been talking about this morning. And to view this not as a political agenda or a national or a business agenda, but as a human one. So I'm describing something hugely ambitious, and some may say idealistic, but I'd rather describe it as pragmatic. So many of the solutions we need, we already have. We've got many of the answers. What gets in the way more often than not is us, is people, is relationships, is how do we do stuff together. So if I go back to just 2 years after that walk in the woods, 18 years ago, I was an entrepreneur in the UK. And I'd spent several years building companies, and I'd got to the point where I was asking myself a lot of questions about purpose. What was I really here for? In the middle of this, a friend invited me to go with them to Ethiopia. We spent 10 days out on a very high remote plateau, meeting with farmers who were building irrigation systems in areas that were suffused with drought and deforestation. Around 250,000 people lived on this particular plateau. They had nowhere else to go, and they were eking out a living and faced with constant famine. On the last day of that trip, I was back in Addis Ababa, and I went to visit a slum on the edge of the city. And there I met a woman named Hasiya. She was squatting down, lighting a fire in front of her little wooden shack. It was about 8 foot square, and she had a bundled up child lying on the ground beside her. And with a local translator, I went over. She was kind of on the edge of the community. We sat down on the ground and we began to have a conversation. She told me about her family. She had 2 children, an 8-year-old boy who was in school, and the 4-year-old daughter that was lying beside her. Her daughter had been born with cerebral palsy. And when she arrived, Hasiya's husband found he couldn't cope, and he left overnight, and she hadn't seen him since. So she was left bringing up these 2 kids on the edge of the slum, cooking bread to sell to the occasional passerby. Well, I found myself just lost for words. It was like there was this big yawning gap between us, and yet there was no gap at all. I was looking at a woman like me, with a deep sense of what we shared. I was part of Hasiya's world, and she was part of mine. I was part of her dignity and her grace and her drive to give her children every opportunity, no matter the cost to her. But I was also part of the neighbors who shunned her, the community that had left her behind. And I felt a mixture of shame, but also deep connection. I came home, and a couple of months later, I founded Leaders Quest. And it was built on the idea that sometimes leaders need a wake-up call to step up and shape a different future. A reminder that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. We began creating experiential programs. Today we work in 25 countries. Our work is designed to do 3 things, to help people do 3 things in a very short space of time. The first one is to explore different perspectives. Traveling here in the US, for example, to rural Appalachia with a group of Silicon Valley leaders, to visit with miners and see what the world looks like through their eyes. Staying there in a local town that's a food desert. Nothing in the shops really resembles what I would consider to be food. A town where the Wi-Fi doesn't flow like water, and where people are asking real questions about future jobs as the mines automate and close. Asking, how can communities like these be part of the new economy? What does growth look like here? And what role might we play in making that happen? The second thing that we do is we help people to see the humanity in one another, even when the gaps appear wide. Taking a group of executives to meet with migrant workers in China, visiting a computer factory, employing 40,000 people. tracing the invisible thread between one of the women on that production line who was working a 12-second repeat cycle in the manufacturing process, and the laptop, the very same laptop model that I was carrying in my bag. Or visiting a prison in Michigan, sitting with prisoners who are preparing after very long sentences to be released. Men who are remarkably insightful about their life journeys and what they've learned on the inside. Being asked, would your company employ me when I get out of here? And struggling to find an answer. You know, in a country that's home to 5% of the world's population and about 25% of the global prison population, this is a really important question. What are we all prepared to do to welcome returning citizens back into our communities? The third thing that we do is we show people abundant possibility. One of the great joys of the kind of work that I spend my time on is that time and time again I see people find abundance in places and situations where they expected only scarcity. Visiting slums in Kenya with the R&D team from a consumer goods giant, they were there to think about how to reduce water consumption in washing products. Taking them out to visit communities that are really water poor, where people spend hours every day carrying buckets of water, and where most families end up doing their clothes washing in a puddle. And then watching those executives return to work, come up with new ideas, speed up their innovation, and end up with new products in half the usual cycle time. Or visiting Greystone Bakery in Yonkers, which makes food for companies like Ben & Jerry's and Unilever's. They have an open hiring policy, recruiting returning citizens who've served their time in jail. They have 3 guiding principles. The company was founded by a Buddhist. The principles are embracing uncertainty, loving action, and non-judgment. Well, earlier this year, I did something I haven't done in my whole working life. I took a few weeks off to just think. I wanted to step back at a time when many of the things that I care most deeply about felt as if they were under threat. And I asked myself, what kind of leaders do we need if we want a world where 9 billion people can live well with one another and in harmony with the planet? And I turned to some of the people that I most admire. Leaders like Sujata Kandahar in India. Sujata spent 10 years creating a fellowship program that's trained 1,200 grassroots women from the most marginalized, impoverished communities. The program helps them to grow. It develops them into extraordinary people, extraordinary leaders, and they today are driving citywide and statewide and in some cases nationwide change. These are women who are largely illiterate. Their efforts in dealing with problems like sanitation in slums, like domestic violence, which is a huge issue in many parts of India, and education of girls who drop out from school on a much higher rate than boys, are impacting millions of people. This is some of the fellows. I went during my break, I went to see them, and I took an overnight train ride into rural Maharashtra and spent some time with some of these women. The program, that fellowship program, begins with understanding yourself. For people who've never really had any confidence, never really been believed in or listened to, who am I? What do I care about? What's my favorite color? It's one of the first questions they ask them. So it starts with understanding yourself. And from there, it gets into understanding others. It's an 18-month program. They attend part-time whilst working and caring for their families. And from there, they learn about how to organize and how to build organizations and how to create communities and coalitions. But the real power and the real lesson, I think, for many of us comes from what I call networked leadership. They have their own Indra's web, their own Indra's net. The ability to build trust, the ability to show and generate mutuality and cooperation, to make things happen at scale and then have it go viral, which is what they've done. And then I turned to another force of nature, a dear friend, Christiana Figueres. Christiana led the Paris Climate Agreement. A Herculean task, inspiring and cajoling 195 countries to commit to targets to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. Christiana leads with what she calls stubborn optimism. She's tiny, by the way, stubborn optimism. She has a fierce belief in the best of people. And every inch of progress on the way to Paris, she celebrated. She praised, no matter how small, never mind if it didn't add up to the right amount. She praised and she celebrated. And in the process, she embodied hope. She showed people that something was possible. She embodied generosity, and it proved infectious. So there are 3 lessons that I'd like to draw from Christiana and from Sujata that I think are relevant to all of us as we think about our work with leaders. The first is we have to get over ourselves, to get out of our own way, to get beyond the fear that actually it's all too much and it's all too complicated, to get beyond ego, to get beyond the fear of losing out or of being insignificant. Maybe our lives don't matter. The need to measure ourselves against one another in order to know that we are important. Getting over ourselves is about profound growth. It's about change. It's about slowing down as the world appears to be speeding up. It's about recalibrating between an obsession with doing and a better balance with being. It's about purpose and compassion and curiosity. It's about humility. We won't solve the kind of collective problems that we have today unless we're prepared to grow as individuals. The second thing that I think we have to do is that we have to learn to lead from uncertainty, to get comfortable with not knowing. It's something we talked about this morning. To become better listeners, to learn to disagree more intelligently, to balance having one foot in the present and another foot in the future, because so many of the decisions that we make today will have an impact 10, 20 years down the road. And the consequences of ignoring that are far more profound than they were in years gone by. It's a brave thing, owning our uncertainty. It's a brave thing to try to paint a picture of the future that people can aspire to and have hope in. And the third thing that I think we need to do is we need to build radical collaboration. The kind of networked leadership that Sujata created and fostered in India, or the painstaking consensus building that Christiana led with at the Paris Agreement. In Leaders' Quest, we talk about relentless generosity, and people often get cross with me about this relentless word. They say, that sounds like very hard work. And the answer is, it is hard work. But I think that it's fundamental to collaboration. You have to be prepared to keep going back and keep extending and keep making space to hear somebody else. It means constantly expanding our own circle of compassion, balancing power and love, and the way in which we use each of them. So I'm going to finish where I began, lying on the forest floor and looking at lichen. You may have wondered what lichen had to do with leadership. Thinking about Indra's net. Few of us will have the chance to look back at the Earth from space, I suspect. But we can all find opportunities to pause and shift our perspective, whether it's in a forest or on the street or at our desks. To seek moments of stillness, to experience things differently, to really appreciate the interconnectedness of life, and the power and the responsibility and the possibility that come with that. Thank you. Now, in that spirit, I'm going to invite you to take a couple of minutes and just be quiet and just be still. And anybody who's playing with their phone, I'll just say, you can put it down. It'll still be there in a little while. So let's just take a couple of minutes to just go into your own heart and soul and to just be quiet.